begin by discussing how the Irish ended up in the Caribbean. This is really when I became aware that they were working alongside enslaved Africans. Some unemployed and impoverished chose indenture as it was their only option for survival, while England gave others the choice of death or indenture as part of the Cromwellian settlement after the English Civil Wars in the mid-17th century. I'd say some chose to relocate with the promise of a new life, largely because of unemployment, especially in the 17th century, was very high across Ireland. Others, because of the English Civil Wars, were seen as enemies. Many did believe they would have the option to return, but there are several letters I've come across in documentation that clearly state prevent them from coming home. Do what you need to do to keep them there. So although it's not illegal for them to return home, one, they don't have the financial means to do so, and two, there were many people working against them. Those sent to the Caribbean primarily ended up in Barbados and St. Kitts. And here, indentured laborers were abused and mistreated due to their transient nature, which typically an indentured laborer is hired up for about 3 to 5 years. But planters, because they only had a finite time to drain them of their skills and strength, would typically use them as much as they could before they were used up for this indenture. English traveler Richard Ligon documented servant abuse during his 2-year residence in Barbados. His 1657 work describes planters beating servants with canes if they were deemed lethargic or if they complained about their working conditions. He further wrote that indenture time was doubled for servants who resisted. In the same year, the Barbados Council decreed that free men, women, and servants of the Irish nation who wandered about as vagabonds refusing to labor should be whipped according to the law. A decade later, English adventurer John Scott described these servants as mostly Irish poor men that are just permitted to live, branded with the epithet of white slaves. Because of the abuses of the indentured Irish, it led to a lot of cases of runaways and rebellions. Those who were deemed riotous and unruly were relocated to Montserrat, and this actually happened a few times. So we see this happening in 1632 with St. Kitts, and then again in 1643 at Barbados. So we see this growing Irish population on Montserrat, and at the same time, we're going to see a slowly growing enslaved population on this island. On this island in particular, we do see some collusion between the two, and this is something that greatly worried authorities. We see a number of laws enacted trying to prevent the two from colluding. And this is how we know, one, that they are working alongside, that they are somehow cooperating with each other, but the difference comes along in their punishment. We see typically a little bit of indenture time extended for the Irish, where they're fined in sugar, but the punishment for enslaved Africans was far worse, murderous, brutal punishments for runaways. Both of them were required to do manual labor. Typically, they were farming tobacco. You'd see indigo quite popular here. Sugar would come a little later, although it didn't grow that well. And you would see both cases of labor, both indentured and enslaved, working to harvest that sugar cane, then to process it through the sugar mills. The same goes with tobacco, harvesting it, going through the process of making it ready for shipment. They are both doing similar labor in terms of hardship. They are both working in the fields. This is how the Irish got this nickname red legs, because they were constantly sunburnt from working in the fields. So we do see them working side by side, doing the same labor, having a similar situation in terms of labor. Where it's going to really differ is that there is a light at the end of the tunnel for the Irish. Many of them were able to break free from their indenture, while slavery, that's for lifetime, and that affects your children as well, of course.